Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading Adam of the Road, and I'm starting chapter 18, Hue and Cry. And as you can see from this picture, someone is being chased, and people are looking out their window and out their door. Hue and Cry in the medieval times was to basically what we would use 911 for. So if you were robbed of something, you would yell and chase the criminal. But by you yelling and chasing the criminal, you have alerted other people that that's why you are running. And by law in medieval times, you needed to help that person try and stop the thief. There was a fine if you did not help. There was also a fine if you were falsely giving a hue and cry. So that's basically what this chapter is going to be about. And I'm not sure who is being robbed and who is being chased, but we'll find out. Hue and Cry. After the rain and the cold, St. Martin's summer brought a spell of warm, sunny weather. The country people were busy plowing the fields and sowing the winter wheat and rye, while rooks cawed in the trees and daws chattered and robin redbreasts flashed among the few remaining leaves. Then they drove the cattle and sheep and swine in from the fallow fields and woods. Some they penned up for the winter, but most they sold or slaughtered and salted for food during the cold months. By Martinmas, all the outdoor work was done. The field fares had come flying home from overseas to spend the winter in England, and it was time to work inside the barns, threshing the grain with long hinged flails and winnowing it with baskets called fans or with sieves. That's where you separate the wheat from the chaff. The people of the manor houses were hunting. Sometimes Adam and his minstrel friends would meet them with hawks on their fists. A heron would rise out of the reeds, and soon a falcon would circle swiftly to grasp it in her talons. The tinkle of the silver bells reminded Adam of Simon Talbot. He wondered where Simon was now and if his broken heart had mended. Once in the forest near Aylesford, they heard the exciting sound of a hunting horn and the baying of hounds. The next moment, a roe dashed past right in front of them, and after it came the big deer hounds, their powerful muscles of thigh and shoulder rippling as they ran. Behind the hounds, men in bright hunting attire came riding. They were gone in a minute, but the stir of their passing hung in the air for a little while. In mid-November, the rain came again, and the cold and the fog. The days closed in early. It was a good time for minstrelsy because nobody could go to sleep so early, and the long evenings must be filled in somehow. When a book cost more than a horse, and few could read, minstrels' tales were almost the only entertainment. Minstrels brought news, too. They told what was going on in the next town, what was happening in London, where the king was. If Roger had been there, he and Adam would have spent many a happy evening with all kinds of people at all kinds of fires. Great and simple, but the Devesses rarely got into people's houses. They did their stunts and told their stories in the marketplace or on the green. Jack would talk about the revolt in Wales and King Edward's going to quail it with the aid of the barons who held land in the Welsh marches. But when people found that he knew no more about it than everybody did, they paid no more attention to him. Sometimes the Devesses got a few halfpence, but when dusk came and they knocked at a house door, they were usually turned away. At the small houses, when they were told there was no room, there was nothing they could do. At the big houses, Jack would demand a minstrel's right of entrance. "We want no jugglers and tumblers here," the porter would snap and slam the door. They slept in barns, if they were lucky, and under hedges or haystacks if they were not. They were often hungry and cold. Adam longed more and more for Roger. The Deveses were jolly people and kind in their way, but they made him as uncomfortable as Master Walter and Dame Alice did, though for very different reasons. They were always promising and never doing. "This very afternoon," they would declare, "Adam shall tell one of his tales, and tomorrow we'll surely start for London." But when the afternoon came, Jack was noisily roaring out his own coarse stories, and the boys turning somersaults, and Adam never had a chance to lift his voice. Instead, he had to play tunes on his harp to attract attention to the others, or provide music for Andrew when he danced on his stilts. And when the next morning came, they were off to Martisworthy or to Chittingford or Whitley, anywhere but along the road to London. The stories that Jack told were not at all like those Roger used to tell. They were short, exaggerated tales, mostly making rude jokes about friars and monks and rich abbots. Adam knew the friars were often greedy and untruthful, and that monks sometimes varied the holy life with hunting and chess playing, and frequently ate and drank too much, that some rich abbots were as powerful and unscrupulous as many of the rich nobles. But who could be better than Master Walter and Dame Alice, or the monks at St. Albans? "People like the stories we tell," Andrew said when Adam objected. "You have to give people what they want. You pretend to be a minstrel. You ought to know that." At first, that sounded like what Roger used to say. A minstrel must fit his tale to his listeners. But when Adam thought it over, he decided it was quite different. Roger told tales that fitted the good in people. Tales about courage and danger and adventure and love. "Well, anyhow," Adam persisted, "Roger got a war horse for his tales, and that's more than Jack ever did." He was sorry the minute he said that. It was a very sore point with the Deveses that so few farthings came their way. "Listen, young'un," said Andrew, "I've heard all I want to hear about Roger. Day and night you talk about him, and I've had enough. From now on, don't even say his name. Here, lend me your harp." Andrew, who had no instrument of his own, was forever borrowing Adam's harp. That was another thing that made Adam uneasy, and yet he did not like to refuse it. They were resting on a bank in the forest of Holt outside Farnham when Andrew plunked away at the harp. Adam looked up at the holly tree over his head and wished that the berries were edible. They had had nothing to eat all day, and it was past dinner time. Adam told the others about what happened the last time he'd been in the forest of Holt, about the merchant and the robbers. "Sir Robert de Ridewear would come running down this road right now," he finished, "and I wouldn't worry a bit. That's one thing about not having silks and spices. Nobody wants to take anything away from you." "But that's how some people get silks and spices," said Lawrence gloomily, "taking them away from somebody else." A heavy black lock of hair fell down his forehead, and he shook it back like a restive horse. "Look," said Allison, "look at that." Along the road came 3 men in shabby green with bows and arrows. Behind them was another on a black horse carrying a deer over the saddle, its legs sticking out stiffly on either side. 2 boys followed, leading greyhounds coupled together, 4 white, 2 tawny, and 2 red. They passed the minstrels without noticing them, and a little further down the road, they turned off on a path leading into the forest. When they disappeared, Allison gasped, "They've been hunting in the king's forest." "Oh, I wouldn't mind having a good piece of venison myself," said Jack with a sigh, and Andrew rubbed his stomach and licked his lips. "If they get caught, they'll be blinded," said Adam. "Well, that's the least of what will happen to them," said Allison vigorously. "Hunting in the king's forest! I wouldn't want to eat venison caught that way, no matter how hungry I was." "Ah, venison's venison," said Lawrence, "and most likely they won't get caught. Why should the king or anybody else own miles of forest and say that no hungry man is to shoot a deer or a hare in it for his dinner?" "Hush," said Allison. "Oh, I won't hush. muttered Lawrence sulkily, lowering his voice nevertheless. Why should some be hungry and others have more food than they can eat? There being no answer to this question, they got up and trudged on to Farnham. Adam, as usual, asked everyone he met if they had seen Roger the minstrel or Jenkin and a red spaniel, though he had long ago given up expecting any answer but no, and was pinning his hopes on London and Christmas. They had little luck in Farnham that day. They got only enough farthings for a glass of ale and a bit of bread all around, and that was not nearly enough for such hungry people. Adam felt tired and dizzy. Let's go to the church, he begged. The parson will give us something to eat and maybe a bed for tonight. Catch a parson giving anything to a minstrel? Said Jack scornfully. Master Walter gave food to any hungry man who came to his door, persisted Adam. Oh, look at Lawrence. Where's he got? Lawrence, who had vanished a short while ago, now joined them with a mysterious gleam in his black eyes and a big bulge in front of his coat. He jerked his head imperatively, and they all wonderingly followed him down the high street and out of town. At the edge of a field, he stopped, looked around. Then he began to take things from beneath the front of his coat. A loaf of bread, part of a leg of mutton, and a meat pie, still warm. Food, he said simply. Spread out on the forest hard ground without cloth or platter, it looked and smelled unbelievably good. Their hands all fluttered out toward it. Benedictite, exclaimed Jack under his breath. Here, said Allison. Wait till I get my knife out and I'll divide it properly. The biggest pieces went to Jack, the next largest to Lawrence and Andrew, the smallest to herself and Adam. They ate without saying a word till the last crumb was gone. Then Jack leaned back against the trunk of a tree and sighed deeply. Ah, he said, I feel better. Adam, too, felt warmed and cheered. The whole world took on a different look. The sky was brighter and the wind less cold. Even the skinny dog, to whom he had given part of his mutton, looked more lovable than usual. I could eat that much again, said Andrew. Gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins, Allison reproved him primly. They represented by a swine in the books. Lawrence kept looking over his shoulder toward the town. Far down the road, small in the distance, some people now came running and waving their arms. Come, cried Lawrence. We've got to get out of here. The urgency in his voice left them in no doubt. Suddenly pale, they all jumped up and set off as fast as they could go along the road toward Guildford. Adam, with the shorter legs, had to trot to keep up with the others. Hurrying so soon after eating gave him a sharp pain in his side, and his head began to ache. Worst of all was the knowledge that flared in his mind like a flash of lightning and jabbed his heart with terror. Lawrence had stolen the food that they had just eaten. Adam had never been so frightened in all his life. He had never before been on the wrong side of the law. It was 9 miles to Guildford, and the afternoon was already well along. Could they shake off their pursuers and get there before curfew? Nobody said a word. They had to save their breath. Running at first, then slowing up to an easier jog trot, they covered the distance between Farnham and Whitewaysand in an hour. There the road forked, one branch going up over the Hog's Back, which is how Adam had gotten there, the other through the forest. Jack stopped and rubbed his forehead, which was, in spite of the chill of the day, wet with perspiration. Which way? He said. The road through the forest led past Jill and John Ferryman's cottage. John thought lovingly of the haven he had found there, but he would not take a gaggle of minstrels there, all wanting to steal food for a dinner. Gaggle was the wrong word, he thought, remembering Simon's teaching. A melody of harpers, you should say, or a poverty of pipers. A poverty of pipers they were indeed. They reminded him that Andrew still had his harp. He started to ask for it, but at that moment Jack decided on the road over the hog's back and they were off again. The people from Farnham who had been following them had long given up and turned back. The point was now to get to Guildford before curfew. Up and up went the white chalk tracks through the rusty brown bracken and the purple-brown heather. As dusk came on, the wind grew sharper. It whistled in the bushes and whipped Adam's hair across his chapped cheeks. There were no wide views now of the Weald and the South Downs on one side, or the silver Thames and London Towers on the other. There was just the wind and the gray sky and the dark creeping out of the low bushes at their feet. Adam's heart pounded in his chest. His breath came in gasps. It was quite dark when at length the road pitched down the hill to the river. They heard curfew ringing several minutes before they reached the bridge. "Now what are we going to do?" said Andrew. "I, for one, don't care to be picked up by the watch and spend the next 6 months in the dungeons at Guildford Castle." "If we go in quietly, we won't arouse the watch," answered Jack. "William the Glover will let us sleep in his counting house if we get to him." They slipped like shadows across the bridge and felt their way up the steep, dark High Street. Whenever they heard a footfall or a voice, they stood stock still and scarcely breathed, like baby partridges freezing among the leaves when danger approaches. They got safely enough to William the Glover's house, but waking him up was another matter. All the windows were shuttered tight and his door locked. Andrew whistled. Jack knocked, softly at first and then more loudly. Suddenly, someone shouted behind them, and lantern light cut through the darkness. "Halt where you are!" commanded a harsh voice. The lantern was lifted so as to shine on all their white, startled faces. Adam saw the shadows flee into the sharp hollows of Lawrence's thin cheeks, making him look like some sinister bird. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" "We're minstrels, may it please you, sir," answered Jack with a whine in his voice that made Adam wince. "We were trying to wake William the Glover to let us in to sleep." "Well, that's a likely story. Will went to London 3 months ago. A Flanders man has this shop. Minstrels, eh? Where'd you come from so late?" "From Farnham, sir," answered Jack, in the same moment that Lawrence, evidently believing that Farnham had better not be mentioned, said, "We've come from Gomshall, and we've lost our way in the Downs." "From Farnham and from Gomshall, is it? And you met here in the dead of night to try Master Etienne's window? I say it looks suspicious, and you look like suspicious characters, and I arrest you in the name of the law." It had happened. Adam's heart sank. What would become of them? How would Roger ever find him now? "Run!" shouted Jack. "Scatter!" He shook the watchman's hand from his shoulder, knocked down the lantern, and kicked it. There was a little squeal from Allison, a scuffle, and the sound of running feet. Adam felt Andrew go past him in a rush before he too turned and ran, stumbling in the dark, groping with his hands to find a way between walls and fences. Now the watchman raised a shout. It was a mighty bellow of a shout. It meant one thing. It meant that he was raising the hue and cry according to the statute made at Westminster in the 13th year of King Edward. Once before, Adam had heard the hue and cry levied, but never had he imagined he would be one of those cowering in the shadows. In all the houses round about, shutters were thrown wide, heads thrust out. The next minute the doors opened and men with torches and lanterns came tumbling out all along the street. Each one shouted as he ran. The din spread to the next street and the next. Now Adam's run through Guildford before, when he was following Jenkin, helped him. He remembered the back lanes and the steps that led down to the river. He backed, he darted across the street and crouched behind a water barrel, and a man with a lantern had pounded past shouting, "Stop, robbers!" Then in the lantern's faint backward gleam, he made for a doorway and flattened himself against it in the shadows, while two Guilford Burgesses ran headlong into each other and hung on, each convinced he had caught a thief. Bit by bit in the dark, amidst all the noise and shouting, Adam groped his way to the steps, scrambled down them. When he reached the river, he returned to the right and ducked under the bridge. There he squatted on the wet gravel between water and the stone pier, while the hue and cry spread from the town on the right side of the river to the settlement around St. Nicholas's Church on the left bank. It was bitterly cold and dank under the bridge. The stones above his head oozed moisture, and the river sent up an icy breath as it flowed past in the blackness. Adam was stiff and aching. His teeth chattered so loudly that he thought people running across the bridge above him might hear them. Gradually, the shouts came further and further apart. No more people tramped across the bridge. Quiet settled down. Adam could not tell whether any of the Devesses had been caught or not. He fervently hoped not. He wondered what had happened to the dog. If only Nick were there to snuggle close and keep him from feeling so alone and frightened. His harp was gone too. Adam still had it. What was the proverb that Roger used to quote? "Alone seldom comes laughing home." A fine time it was to remember that. Well, we did learn more about the hue and cry. I'm sorry that Adam was involved with that, though. But there's good news on the horizon. Chapter 19 says news of Roger. So perhaps he finds his dad in the next chapter. Bye-bye.